Our story tonight will transport you to the distant past, to a time of great empires and of people whose names are forever etched in the ages. This is the account of the legendary commander and conqueror, Alexander the Great. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow our voice to guide you into a world of heroic campaigns, great ambitions, and ancient secrets. We begin. The air in the grand palace of Babylon was thick with incense, humidity, and fear. Outside, the city baked under the Mesopotamian sun of June, 323 BC. Inside, the master of the known world was dying. Alexander, the king of Macedonia, the pharaoh of Egypt, the lord of Asia, the man who had never lost a battle, was being defeated by an enemy he could not see, a fever that burned through his veins with relentless cruelty. He was just 32 years old. Around his bed gathered the titans he had created, his generals, men with names that would soon echo through eternity. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Perdiccas. Their faces, weathered by a decade of war and 1,000 miles of marching, were masks of disbelief and raw ambition. They had followed this man from the hills of Greece to the plains of India. They had seen him charge into enemy lines, take arrows meant for them, and weep for their fallen. He was more than a king to them. He was a force of nature, a demigod in the flesh. And now that force was fading. The empire, stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River, held its breath. It was an empire built not on institutions or laws, but on the sheer will and charisma of one man. And as his will faltered, the question hung in the air, unspoken but desperate. What happens next? Who would inherit this colossal, unstable creation? According to legend, the generals pressed closer, their voices urgent. To whom do you leave your kingdom, Alexander? His body was weak, his voice a mere whisper, ravaged by days of agony. He allegedly summoned his last ounce of strength, looked upon the faces of the men who had conquered the world with him, and uttered two words that were not a solution, but a prophecy of chaos, of bloodshed, and of a war that would last for 40 years. Toi Kratistoi. To the strongest. He did not name an heir. He did not choose a successor. He threw his empire into the air like a golden apple, a prize to be claimed by whoever had the strength and cunning to seize it. In that moment, he ensured that his death would be as transformative and violent as his life. The world he had built began to fracture before his body was even cold. To understand the man whose final words unleashed such a storm, we must first understand the world that forged him, a world of fading empires and rising kingdoms, a stage perfectly set for the birth of a conqueror. The middle of the 4th century BC was a time of exhaustion and opportunity. The glories of classical Greece, the age of Pericles in Athens and the heroes of Thermopylae, were fading into memory, leaving behind a power vacuum, a fractured landscape of proud but weary city-states. For nearly a century, the Greeks had been consumed by internal conflict. The devastating Peloponnesian War had shattered the Athenian Empire. In its wake, the victorious Spartans installed a brutal puppet government in Athens known as the 30 Tyrants, whose brief reign of terror demonstrated to all of Greece that Spartan victory did not mean freedom. This led to more war. Sparta's arrogance soon pushed the other states, like Thebes, to rise against it. They fought and fought, in shifting alliances, winning tactical victories that led to strategic ruin. Their entire military doctrine was based around the hoplite phalanx, a block of heavily armed infantrymen. While formidable, this style of warfare was rigid, and generations of fighting each other meant they perfected a system for fighting themselves, but not for adapting to new threats. Each campaign drained precious manpower and wealth, leaving the entire Greek peninsula vulnerable. They were masters of philosophy and art, but they had forgotten how to be brothers. Their freedom had become the freedom to destroy one another. To the east loomed the great adversary, the Persian Achaemenid Empire. It was a behemoth, stretching from Egypt to the borders of India. It was fabulously wealthy, a vast tapestry of diverse peoples and cultures, all ruled by the great king. But this giant had grown slow. Its vast territories were managed by governors called satraps, who often ruled their domains like personal kingdoms, sometimes even rebelling against the throne. The court itself was a viper's nest of intrigue and assassinations, a constant distraction that prevented the empire from projecting its full power. While its resources were immense, its military had not significantly evolved. The great king found it easier to influence the Greek world not with armies, but with gold. Persian money funded different sides of the endless Greek conflicts, a clever strategy to keep their fractious Western neighbors divided and weak, forever squabbling and never uniting to pose a real threat. The Persian Empire was a great, slumbering lion, still mighty, but riddled with internal sickness and unaware of the hungry wolf cub growing on its frontier. This wolf was Macedonia. To the sophisticated Greeks of Athens and Thebes, Macedonia was a backwater, a half-savage kingdom in the mountainous north. Its people were hardy shepherds and horsemen, seen as crude country cousins who spoke a rough dialect of Greek. They were not a democracy of citizens, but a kingdom of subjects ruled by a warrior king. Their social structure was built on personal loyalty. The king was the first among his noble companions, the Hetairoi, who fought beside him on horseback. This system forged intense bonds between the ruler and his men, a stark contrast to the bickering politicians and hired generals of the south. The Greeks saw them as drinkers, fighters, and politically primitive, useful for their timber and horses, but not to be taken seriously as a power. This arrogance would be their undoing. They saw a rustic kingdom. They failed to see a nation with a deep reservoir of manpower, united by loyalty to a single leader, and free from the political paralysis that was bleeding the South dry. This was the world ready for a titan. A fractured Greece, too proud to unite and too weak to resist. A vast Persian Empire, too comfortable to recognize a rising threat. And in between, an overlooked kingdom, Macedonia, brimming with the raw materials of empire. The stage was set. The power was there for the taking. All that was needed was a leader with the vision to unite the Macedonian tribes, the cunning to dominate the squabbling Greeks, and the ambition to challenge the Persian lion. That leader would first be the father, Philip II, who would forge the army. But the one who would wield it to shatter the old world and build a new one in its place would be his son, Alexander. Alexander was born in 356 BC, into the heart of a storm. That storm was the marriage of his parents, a union of two formidable and violently incompatible forces. King Philip II of Macedon, and Olympias, a princess from the neighboring kingdom of Epirus. To understand Alexander, one must first stand in the shadow of these two titans, for he was the product of their genius, their ambition, and their war. His father, Philip, was arguably the most brilliant man of his age. He had ascended to the throne of a backward, fractured kingdom on the verge of collapse and, through sheer force of will, transformed it into a military superpower. He was not just a king who gave orders. He was a warrior who led from the front. His body was a roadmap of his campaigns. He had lost an eye to an arrow at the siege of Methone. His collarbone was shattered, and his leg was permanently lamed. These injuries were not signs of weakness, but badges of honor that proved to his soldiers that he shared their dangers. In his youth, Philip had been a political hostage in Thebes, where he studied their revolutionary military tactics. When he returned to Macedon, he perfected them. He reformed the army, lengthening the sarissa, the Macedonian spear, to an incredible 18 feet, turning the traditional phalanx into an unstoppable forest of deadly points. He was the first to truly integrate infantry, skirmishers, and heavy cavalry into a single combined arms force. But he was more than a general. He was a master of diplomacy, a cunning politician who used marriage, bribery, and threats with the same skill he used a sword. He was also a man of immense appetites, known for his hard drinking, his numerous wives, and his boisterous, often intimidating presence. He was a force of nature, a pragmatic and ruthless visionary who saw the weakness of Greece and intended to become its master. Olympias was a different kind of power altogether. She hailed from the mountainous, semi-wild kingdom of Epirus, from a royal line that claimed descent from the mythical hero Achilles. She was a woman of intense passion, intelligence, and fierce ambition. Her world was not one of pragmatic politics, but of dark mysticism and ancient gods. She was a devout follower of the mystery cults of Dionysus, secretive rituals that involved ecstatic dancing and the handling of large tame serpents, which she reportedly kept in her chambers. This behavior fascinated some but deeply unsettled many in the more conventional Macedonian court. Her marriage to Philip was a cold political alliance, a tool to secure Macedonia's western border. For Philip, who followed Macedonian tradition, taking multiple wives to cement alliances was standard practice. He saw Olympias as one wife among many. But for Olympias, a proud princess from an ancient lineage, this was an unforgivable insult. She believed herself to be his one true queen, and the presence of other women in Philip's life was a constant source of jealousy and incandescent fury. Their relationship was a battlefield, a clash of strategy against passion, of worldly ambition against divine pride. Into this cauldron of political ambition and personal animosity, Alexander was born. Legend holds that on the day of his birth, Philip received 3 separate pieces of good news. His most trusted general, Parmenion, had defeated an invading army. His horse had won a prestigious race at the Olympic Games, and his son and heir had been born. The omens were clear. This boy was destined for victory. Olympias fed this belief with stories of her own. She claimed that on their wedding night, a thunderbolt had struck her womb without harming her, a clear sign that the child she carried was not the son of a mere mortal king, but of the king of the gods himself, Zeus. This was the toxic and potent inheritance of Alexander. He was raised in a court torn between 2 opposing worlds, observing this war between his parents from his earliest days. He saw how his father charmed and intimidated foreign envoys, and then later, how his mother worked to undermine Philip's other wives and their children. He learned about power not just from lessons, but from the very air he breathed, an atmosphere thick with suspicion, rivalry, and ambition. From Philip, he learned strategy, politics, and the grim realities of leadership. He watched his father command armies and build an empire through calculation and grit. Philip taught him to be a king of men. But from Olympias, Alexander absorbed something else entirely: a burning sense of destiny, a belief in his own transcendent nature. She whispered in his ear that the blood of heroes and gods flowed through his veins, that he was not bound by the same rules as other mortals. She nurtured his ambition, not just to be a great king like his father, but to be something more, something legendary. He was a child caught between a father who wanted him to conquer the world, and a mother who told him he deserved to rule it as a god. This internal conflict, this duality of the pragmatic warrior and the divine dreamer, would become the engine of his entire life. The relationship between Alexander and his father was a complex tapestry of admiration, rivalry, and deep-seated tension. Alexander was acutely aware that he was the son of a living legend. He longed for Philip's approval, yet at the same time, he feared that his father's endless victories would leave nothing for him to conquer. This fear was a core part of his being, a concept the Greeks called pathos, an intense, almost painful yearning for something seemingly unattainable. For Alexander, that unattainable thing was a legacy that could surpass his father's. The ancient historian Plutarch tells a story that perfectly captures this anxiety. When news of another of Philip's successful campaigns would arrive, the young Alexander would not rejoice. Instead, he would turn to his friends and complain, "Boys, my father will get everything before I can. He won't leave any great and brilliant deeds for me to show the world." From his earliest years, he was not just thinking about being a king. He was thinking about his legacy, a legacy he felt was already being overshadowed. Yet there were moments of profound connection. The most famous of these is the story of Bucephalus. A horse trader had brought the magnificent black stallion to Philip's court. The animal was enormous, powerful, but utterly wild. In the dusty courtyard, Philip's most experienced grooms tried and failed to manage him, each one thrown violently to the ground. Philip, growing impatient, was about to send the horse away as a lost cause when Alexander, still a boy, spoke up, insisting he could tame the beast. The court laughed, but Alexander was observant. He had noticed something the others had missed. The horse was not vicious, but terrified of its own dancing shadow. With a confidence that silenced the onlookers, Alexander approached Bucephalus, took the reins, and calmly turned him to face the sun, so his shadow fell behind him. He spoke to the horse in a low, soothing voice, stroking his neck until the stallion's trembling ceased. Then, with one fluid motion, he swung himself onto its back. The horse, now calm, obeyed his command. Alexander rode him around the courtyard to the astonishment of everyone present. When he dismounted, Philip is said to have wept with pride, kissing his son and declaring, "My boy, you must find a kingdom equal to your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." In that moment, Philip saw not just a son, but an heir worthy of his own greatness. Bucephalus would become Alexander's constant companion, carrying him into battle all the way to India. But as Alexander grew into a capable young man, the underlying tensions began to surface more violently. The rift between Olympias and Philip widened into a chasm. Olympias constantly warned her son to be wary of his father's other children, planting seeds of suspicion. This tension culminated in a disastrous event known as the Pyxidaris affair. Philip was arranging a marriage for his other, intellectually disabled son, Aristeus, to the daughter of a powerful Persian satrap in Asia Minor named Pyxidaris. For Philip, it was a clever diplomatic move. But Alexander, paranoid and insecure after the recent fights with his father, saw it as a threat. He believed Philip was grooming Aristeus as a potential alternative heir. In a staggering act of defiance, Alexander went behind his father's back. He sent his own secret envoy to Pyxidaris, offering to marry the satrap's daughter himself, thus sabotaging his father's plans. When Philip discovered this, his fury was immense. He stormed into Alexander's chambers, not with a sword, but with words that cut deeper, berating him for his lack of faith and for thinking so little of himself that he would try to marry the daughter of a minor foreign official. As punishment, Philip exiled several of Alexander's closest friends and advisors from Macedon, isolating his son. This broken trust formed the backdrop for the final breaking point: Philip's wedding to a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This was different from his other political marriages. Cleopatra was a pure-blooded Macedonian. This meant that any son she bore Philip would be seen by some as a more legitimate heir than Alexander, whose mother was a foreigner. At the wedding banquet, with wine flowing freely, the bride's uncle, a powerful general named Attalus, stood to give a toast. Drunk and arrogant, he asked the Macedonians to pray to the gods for a legitimate heir from the new union. The insult was direct, public, and politically charged. Alexander, enraged, leaped to his feet, shouting, "You villain, am I then a bastard?" and hurled his wine cup at Attalus. The hall erupted. Philip, in a drunken fury at this insult to his new family, drew his sword and lunged at his own son. But in his rage, he tripped and fell sprawling to the floor. Alexander, standing over him, mocked him bitterly. "Look, men," he sneered. "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another without falling." The damage was done. The public humiliation was unforgivable. Alexander and his mother fled into exile, their relationship with the king seemingly shattered. While a fragile reconciliation was eventually brokered, The trust between father and son was broken forever. Alexander returned to Macedon, but he returned to a court filled with suspicion. He now understood, with chilling clarity, that his greatest rival was his own father. The stage was set for the final tragic act of their relationship. Even in the midst of the toxic rivalry between father and son, Philip of Macedon was a pragmatist. He knew that a king needed more than just courage in battle. He needed a disciplined mind. And so, around the age of 13, just before the family conflicts reached their breaking point, Philip made one of the most consequential decisions for the future of his kingdom and the world. He hired a personal tutor for his son. He didn't just hire any scholar. He hired the most brilliant mind in all of Greece, the philosopher Aristotle. To remove the young prince from the poisonous intrigues of the court at Pella, Philip established a school in a tranquil, secluded location called Mysa, at a place known as the Temple of the Nymphs. Here, surrounded by shaded groves, cool streams, and stone colonnades, Alexander and a select group of other sons of Macedonian nobles would receive an education unlike any other. The setting was deliberate. Philip wanted to forge a new generation of leaders who were not just warriors, but educated, thoughtful men, bonded by a shared, formative experience under the greatest teacher of their time. Aristotle was then in his early 40s, already a giant in the intellectual world. He had spent 2 decades at Plato's Academy in Athens, becoming its star pupil. But unlike his teacher Plato, who was fascinated by abstract forms and ideal concepts, Aristotle was profoundly interested in the observable, tangible world. He was a polymath in the truest sense, a biologist, a logician, a political scientist, an ethicist, and a literary critic. The choice was not random. Aristotle's own father had been the royal physician to Philip's father, King Amyntas III, so a trusted family connection already existed. More importantly, Philip likely saw in Aristotle the perfect blend of the theoretical and the practical. He needed someone who could teach his son not just about the good life, but about the realities of ruling. The curriculum was vast, but it began with a foundation that would shape Alexander's entire worldview: the epic poetry of Homer. The story of the Trojan War, the Iliad, was more than just a story for the Greeks. It was a moral textbook, a guide to what it meant to be a hero. Aristotle prepared a special annotated copy of the epic for his student, a version that Alexander would carry with him on all his campaigns. It is said he slept with it under his pillow, right next to his dagger. This single image reveals the core of Alexander's education: the fusion of the highest intellectual pursuits with the ever-present reality of violence. From the hero Achilles, Alexander learned about the concept of arete, a Greek ideal of excellence, virtue, and the pursuit of immortal glory through great deeds. Achilles chose a short, glorious life over a long, unremarkable one, a choice that Alexander would consciously emulate. From this heroic foundation, Aristotle built a framework of ethics and politics. He taught Alexander his theories of government, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. For Aristotle, the ultimate purpose of any state was to allow its citizens to live a virtuous life. But his teachings carried a sharp, culturally biased edge that would have profound consequences. Aristotle, like most Greeks of his time, believed in a fundamental distinction between Greeks and non-Greeks, whom he termed barbarians. He taught that barbarians were slaves by nature, intellectually and morally inferior to Hellenes, and that it was the natural order of things for them to be ruled by their superiors. This wasn't just a casual prejudice. It was a formal philosophical doctrine, taught to a young, ambitious prince who would soon have the power to put that theory into brutal practice. It gave a philosophical justification for conquest, framing it not as mere aggression, but as the imposition of a superior, enlightened order upon an inferior, chaotic world. This idea would become the intellectual bedrock for the invasion of the Persian Empire. Beyond the philosophical justification for empire, Aristotle equipped Alexander with the practical intellectual tools needed to conquer and govern a world. He taught the young prince the art and science of reason itself. Aristotle was the first person in history to formalize the study of logic. He showed Alexander how to construct a sound argument, how to identify fallacies in the reasoning of others, and how to think about problems methodically, breaking them down into their component parts. This was not an abstract academic exercise. For a future general, the ability to think with cold, hard clarity in the chaos of a battle, to follow a chain of cause and effect, was a weapon more powerful than any spear. This training in logic was paired with rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Alexander would not always be able to command obedience. Sometimes he would need to inspire it. Aristotle would have trained him in how to structure a speech, how to appeal to the emotions of his soldiers, and how to project an aura of unshakable confidence. But perhaps the most profound and lasting gift Aristotle gave Alexander was a scientific curiosity about the world. At his core, Aristotle was a biologist, an empiricist who believed that true knowledge came not from abstract ideals, but from direct observation and categorization of the natural world. He would have walked with Alexander through the groves of Mysa, encouraging him to study the habits of animals, the structures of plants, and the patterns of the weather. He taught Alexander to be relentlessly curious, to ask why, and to seek evidence before forming a conclusion. This scientific mindset transformed Alexander from a mere conqueror into a genuine explorer. This influence is undeniable when one looks at his later campaigns. Alexander's invasion of Asia was also one of the greatest scientific expeditions in history. He took with him a retinue of botanists, zoologists, topographers, and surveyors. As his army marched, this team of scholars collected, studied, and catalogued the strange new flora and fauna they encountered. He sent hundreds of biological specimens back to Greece, many of them presumably to his old teacher, Aristotle. His desire to see the great outer sea, his expeditions into unknown deserts, and his constant questioning of local peoples about their geography and customs were all driven by this Aristotelian spirit of inquiry. He wasn't just conquering lands. He was actively trying to understand them, to map them, and to place them within a rational, ordered system. Furthermore, coming from a family of physicians, Aristotle possessed a deep knowledge of medicine and biology. He would have taught Alexander the fundamentals of human anatomy, the importance of diet and hygiene, and how to diagnose common illnesses. For a general responsible for the health of tens of thousands of soldiers marching through foreign lands, this knowledge was invaluable. It also gave Alexander a practical understanding of the limits of the human body and the severity of battlefield wounds, an understanding he would need when dealing with the numerous injuries he himself would sustain. This unique and intensive education lasted for approximately 3 years. It came to an abrupt end when Alexander was just 16. His father, Philip, ever the pragmatist, decided that his son's formal schooling was over and his practical training must begin. Philip was launching a major campaign, and in an extraordinary show of trust, he left Alexander in Pella to rule Macedon as regent in his absence. The student had now become the ruler. The legacy of Aristotle's teaching was immense, but also complex. He had molded Alexander's mind, giving him the heroic ideal of Achilles, the logical tools of a strategist, and the curious mind of a scientist. He had handed his student the intellectual keys to the world, but the student would ultimately use those keys to unlock doors the teacher never dreamed of. Aristotle taught the virtue of moderation, but Alexander would live a life of epic excess. Aristotle preached the superiority and self-sufficiency of the Greek city-state, the polis, but Alexander would go on to forge a vast, multicultural empire that rendered the polis obsolete. The education was a foundation, but the ambition of the student would build a structure far grander and more terrifying than the teacher could have ever envisioned. Alexander's formal education ended, but his true schooling was just beginning. At the age of 16, when Philip left to campaign against Byzantium, he appointed his son as regent of Macedon. It was a test, a chance to see if Aristotle's lessons had taken root. He would not have to wait long for an answer. Seeing a mere boy on the throne, the Mede, a fierce Thracian tribe on Macedonia's northern border, decided it was the perfect time to rebel. They likely expected a hesitant, uncertain response. They were wrong. Without waiting for instructions from his father, Alexander acted with a speed and decisiveness that would define his entire career. He mustered the troops left under his command, marched north into the rugged hill country, and fell upon the rebels. The campaign was short, swift, and brutal. He crushed the uprising completely. But Alexander did not stop at simply restoring order. He drove the Mede from their primary stronghold, colonized it with a new population loyal to Macedon, and in a breathtaking display of youthful ambition, renamed it Alexandropolis, the city of Alexander. It was the first of many cities that would bear his name, a pattern of conquest, colonization, and self-aggrandizement that he would replicate across the Asian continent. Even as a teenager, he wasn't just defending his father's kingdom. He was already building his own legacy, literally stamping his name onto the map of the world. When Philip returned, he was undoubtedly impressed. He had left a boy in charge and returned to find a conqueror. Now certain of his son's abilities, Philip was ready for the final stage of his own grand plan, the subjugation of Greece. His relentless expansion had finally provoked a desperate reaction from the proud city-states of the south. In Athens, the great orator Demosthenes delivered a series of powerful, scathing speeches, his famous Philippics, denouncing Philip as a northern barbarian and a threat to Greek liberty. His words caught fire, and soon a final grand coalition was formed. Athens and Thebes, traditional rivals, united their forces to confront the Macedonian threat. The stage was set for a single, decisive battle that would determine the fate of Greece for centuries to come. The battle would be fought on a plain near the town of Chaeronea in the summer of 338 BC. The stakes could not have been higher. For the Greeks, it was the last stand for the freedom of the polis and the classical way of life. For Philip, it was the ultimate test of his new army and his bid for hegemony over all of Hellas. The armies were evenly matched in size, but the Greek forces contained one of the most legendary military units of the age, the Theban Sacred Band. This was a corps of 300 elite professional soldiers, reputedly composed of 150 pairs of male lovers, who were sworn to defend each other to the death. They were considered the finest heavy infantry in the world, and they were positioned at the place of honor on the right of the Greek line. Philip, a master of both strategy and psychology, gave his 18-year-old son the most critical task of the day. Alexander was given command of the elite companion cavalry on the Macedonian left wing, placing him directly opposite the legendary Thebans. It was the ultimate test of the young prince's courage and skill. As the battle began, Philip, commanding the right wing of his army, executed a brilliant and daring maneuver. He ordered his veterans to feign a retreat, slowly giving ground. The Athenians on the Greek left, smelling blood and victory, broke their discipline and charged forward in a disorganized rush. As they surged ahead, they fatally exposed their own flank and created a gap in the center of the Greek battle line. This was the moment Philip had been waiting for, and it was the moment Alexander seized. Seeing the gap open, he led the companion cavalry in a thunderous, perfectly timed charge. They smashed through the weakened Greek center, cutting the army in two. Then, wheeling his squadrons, Alexander turned and slammed into the exposed flank and rear of the Greek right wing, directly where the Theban Sacred Band was fighting. Surrounded and overwhelmed, the legendary Thebans refused to break or surrender. They fought with savage courage, dying where they stood to the very last man. Alexander had not just defeated them, he had annihilated them. Philip's strategy had won the battle, but Alexander's decisive charge had delivered the killing blow. On the fields of Chaeronea, the age of Greek freedom died, and the age of Alexander began. In the aftermath of the Battle of Kyrenia, Philip of Macedon stood as the undisputed master of Greece. He treated the defeated with calculated pragmatism. Thebes, which had resisted fiercely, was punished harshly. But Athens, whose naval power and cultural prestige he still respected, was offered surprisingly lenient terms. Philip's goal was not just to conquer the Greeks, but to lead them. He summoned delegates from all the major city-states to the city of Corinth, and there formed a new alliance, the League of Corinth. On the surface, it was a federation for mutual defense. In reality, it was the instrument of Macedonian domination. The Greek state swore oaths of loyalty, their endless internal wars were forbidden, and Philip was named hegemon, the supreme commander of all their forces. With Greece finally unified, Philip announced the true purpose of his lifelong ambition, a plan so audacious it stunned the world. He would lead a pan-Hellenic army, a great crusade of Greeks and Macedonians, on a war of revenge against the Persian Empire. It was to be a war to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor and to punish Persia for its invasions of Greece over a century earlier. The plan was set in motion. He sent an advance force of 10,000 men into Asia under the command of his most trusted general, Parmenion, to secure a foothold. The invasion of the largest empire on earth was imminent. But Philip would never see Asia. In 336 BC, 2 years after his triumph at Kyrenia, the royal court gathered at the old capital of Aegae for a grand festival. The occasion was the wedding of Philip's daughter, another Cleopatra. The event was designed to be a magnificent display of Philip's power, a celebration of his dynasty. On the second day, a procession moved towards the city's theater. Philip, at the peak of his glory, walked in the open, flanked by his son Alexander on one side and his new son-in-law on the other. Feeling supremely confident among his people, he commanded his bodyguards to fall back, a fatal gesture of arrogance. As the king entered the theater, a figure darted from the crowd. It was Pausanias, a member of his own personal bodyguard. Before anyone could react, Pausanias plunged a long dagger deep into Philip's chest, killing him almost instantly. In the ensuing chaos, the assassin fled towards the city gates where escape horses were waiting. He nearly made it, but he tripped on a vine and was cornered and killed by other members of the royal guard. The official motive seemed clear enough. Pausanias had been a former lover of Philip. He had been brutally raped by men loyal to General Attalus, the new queen's uncle. Pausanias had demanded justice, but Philip, needing Attalus's political and military support, had ignored his pleas. The assassination, therefore, was presented as a crime of passion, the desperate act of a dishonored man seeking personal revenge. But for many, this explanation was too simple, too convenient. The questions began almost immediately. Who had prepared Pausanias's escape horses? How could a lone bodyguard plan such a perfect assassination? Suspicion swirled around the two people who benefited most. First was Philip's estranged wife, Olympias. She had a powerful motive. Philip's new Macedonian wife had recently borne him a son, a potential pure-blooded heir who could displace Alexander. Philip's death solved that problem instantly. Olympias was known for her ruthlessness and had only recently returned from exile. And then there was the darker question. Was Alexander himself involved? He had been in open, violent conflict with his father. His position as heir was not entirely secure. While no concrete evidence has ever linked him to the crime, the assassination conveniently removed the one man who stood in the way of his own ambition. The truth of who orchestrated the murder died with Pausanias, but Alexander, just 20 years old, was now the king. He did not waste a moment in grief. He acted with chilling speed. Guided by his mother, he unleashed a merciless purge to secure his throne. Parmenion, still in Asia, was persuaded to support him, and his rival, General Attalus, was promptly executed. Back in Macedon, Olympias orchestrated the murder of Philip's last wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, and her infant son. Other potential claimants to the throne were systematically eliminated. Alexander presented himself to the army, secured their loyalty with promises of glory and wealth, and was acclaimed King of Macedon. Within weeks of his father's death, the young king had bathed his throne in the blood of his own family, wiping out all internal opposition. The shadow of his father was gone, and now his own age could truly begin. With the throne of Macedon secured by blood and fear, the 20-year-old Alexander faced a new challenge. The death of a great king was always a moment of opportunity for his enemies. From the wild tribal lands to the north and west, and the deceptively calm city-states of Greece to the south, the nations Philip had subdued began to stir. They saw a young, inexperienced king who had just purged his own family. They assumed Macedon was unstable and vulnerable. They were about to receive their first lesson about the son of Philip. Alexander understood that he could not begin his father's grand invasion of Persia while leaving a restive and rebellious empire at his back. He needed to remind everyone, with swift and brutal clarity, who was now in charge. In the spring of 335 BC, he did not wait for the rebellions to start. He marched north on the offensive. His first target were the tribes of Thrace. In a campaign that showcased his tactical brilliance, he drove them back. At one mountain pass, the enemy had gathered a line of wagons at the top of a hill, intending to roll them down to crush his advancing phalanx. Alexander, ever adaptable, gave a simple order. Where the pass was wide, the soldiers were to open ranks and create a channel for the wagons to pass harmlessly through. Where it was narrow, they were to lie flat, lock their shields together over their heads, and let the wagons roll over them. The disciplined Macedonians did exactly that. The wagons bounced harmlessly over their shield roof, and Alexander's men charged up the hill to scatter the shocked enemy. He pushed further north until he reached the banks of the mighty Danube River, the edge of the known world for many Greeks. To intimidate the tribes on the far side, he did what was considered impossible. Under the cover of a single night, his engineers used leather tents stuffed with straw to create makeshift buoyancy aids, and his army conducted a lightning-fast amphibious crossing. He routed the enemy, burned a village as a show of force, made a sacrifice to the gods, and then crossed back, having made his point. No river, no border would keep him out. As he finished his campaign on the Danube, word arrived of another, even larger rebellion to the west. The Illyrians were in open revolt. Alexander, whose army had already been marching and fighting for weeks, did not rest. He force-marched his men across hundreds of miles of rugged mountain terrain with incredible speed. His arrival at the Illyrian fortress of Pelium was so sudden it seemed like an apparition, shattering the enemy's morale before the fighting even began. Through a series of daring night attacks and clever maneuvers that feigned retreat only to draw the enemy into a trap, he crushed this rebellion as well. His speed had become his greatest psychological weapon. But while he was pacifying his northern frontiers, the most dangerous news of all arrived. A rumor had swept through Greece that Alexander had been killed in battle in Illyria. For the city of Thebes, which still chafed under the Macedonian garrison imposed upon it after Kyrenia, this was a call to freedom. With the encouragement of orators in Athens and the quiet funding of Persian gold, the Thebans revolted. They surrounded the Macedonian garrison on their citadel, the Cadmea, and declared their city independent. Alexander received the news in the heart of Illyria. His response was a terrifying demonstration of his energy and will. He immediately turned his army south. He marched them from the borders of Illyria to the gates of Thebes, a journey of roughly 240 miles, or 380 kilometers, over mountains and difficult terrain. He completed the journey in about 13 days. The speed was inhuman, so unbelievable that when his army appeared on the horizon, the Thebans refused to believe it was him. They were convinced Alexander was dead, and that this must be some other Macedonian army. They had gambled their city's future on a rumor, and they had lost. Even then, Alexander showed a moment of restraint. He marched his army around the walls, showing his full strength, and offered the Thebans a chance to surrender and turn over their leaders. Arrogantly, the Thebans refused. They still believed they could win. Alexander's patience was at an end. He had spent a year securing his borders with lightning campaigns and brilliant victories. Now, one of the oldest and most glorious cities in Greece had defied him. He unleashed his army for the final assault. The assault on Thebes was swift and merciless. The Macedonian veterans, hardened by years of brutal tribal warfare, showed little restraint. The city fell quickly. What followed was an act of cold, calculated statecraft that would echo throughout history. The fate of Thebes was not decided by Alexander alone. In a masterful political move, he convened the Council of the League of Corinth, the very alliance Thebes had betrayed, and asked them to pass judgment. Thebes' ancient rivals and neighbors, eager for revenge, voted for the harshest possible punishment: utter annihilation. By the authority of his Greek allies, Alexander carried out the sentence. The city of Thebes, a jewel of the classical world, a city of poets, heroes, and legends, was systematically destroyed. Its walls were torn down, its ancient buildings were leveled, and its territory was divided among the victorious cities. The entire surviving population, some 30,000 men, women, and children, were rounded up and sold into slavery. The destruction was near total, but it was not without Alexander's characteristic sense of calculated symbolism. He gave explicit orders to spare the temples of the gods, and in a gesture that showed his deep reverence for Greek culture even as he was destroying a Greek city, he commanded that the house of the great poet Pindar be left standing. He also spared the descendants of the poet and any Thebans who had officially opposed the war with Macedon. The message sent by the razing of Thebes was brutally effective. A shock wave of terror swept across the Greek peninsula. All thoughts of rebellion vanished overnight. In Athens, the orator Demosthenes, who had celebrated the Theban revolt, now fell silent. The Athenians frantically sent ambassadors to Alexander, begging for forgiveness. Alexander had secured Greece, but he had done so not through diplomacy, as his father had, but through a single unforgettable act of terror that left no doubt about the price of defiance. His rear was now secure. The path to Asia was open. Returning to Macedon, he spent the winter of 335 and spring of 334 BC in a frenzy of preparation for the great invasion. He settled the affairs of his kingdom, appointing his father's most trusted and experienced general, Antipater, as regent in his absence. He left him with a strong force of 12,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry to maintain control over Macedon and Greece. He then displayed a kind of magnificent, almost reckless generosity. He gave away nearly all of his royal lands, estates, and revenues to his friends and generals, ensuring their loyalty and setting them up as powerful nobles. As he was distributing these gifts, his friend Perdiccas asked him, "Alexander, what are you keeping for yourself?" He replied with one word: hopes. In the spring of 334 BC, his army was ready. It was a force of about 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Not a massive army by Persian standards, but arguably the most professional, battle-hardened fighting force on the planet. He marched them to the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. As the fleet crossed, Alexander stood at the prow of his own ship. Before it even landed, he hurled his spear from the ship, and it stuck quivering in the Asian soil. He was the first to leap ashore, symbolically claiming the entire continent as Spear-Won territory. His war was not for negotiation or settlement. It was for total conquest. His first act on Asian soil was not military, but deeply personal and symbolic. He led a contingent of his men to the site of ancient Troy. For Alexander, a lifelong devotee of the Iliad, this was a sacred pilgrimage. He saw himself as the new Achilles, and his invasion of Persia as a new Trojan War, a great heroic struggle between West and East. He staged a series of powerful rituals to wrap his campaign in the cloak of myth. He and his closest friend, Hephaestion, ran naked to the tombs of the heroes Achilles and Patroclus, anointing them with oil and laying wreaths. This was a public declaration of their bond, mirroring that of the legendary heroes. From the Temple of Athena, Alexander took a sacred shield that was said to have been used in the Trojan War itself, a relic he would have carried before him in all his battles. This was more than just superstition. It was psychological warfare and brilliant propaganda. He was framing his invasion not as a mere political or military act, but as the fulfillment of a heroic, almost divine destiny. He had arrived in Asia, declared his intentions, and aligned himself with the gods and heroes of old. Now, the Persian Empire would have to respond. The first great test was imminent. Having wrapped himself in the heroic legacy of Troy, Alexander turned to face the reality of the Persian Empire. The local Persian governors, the satraps of Asia Minor, had finally gathered their forces to confront the invader. Within their ranks was an experienced and intelligent Greek mercenary general named Memnon of Rhodes. Memnon understood the Macedonians. He knew they were the finest heavy infantry in the world, hardened by years of war, and that to face them in a pitched battle was a terrible risk. He urged the Persian commanders to adopt a scorched earth strategy. He advised them to avoid a direct fight, to burn their own fields and granaries, and to retreat inland. Alexander's army, he argued, was far from home and depended on foraging for supplies. Without food, its momentum would halt, and the invasion would starve to death. It was a brilliant strategy, but the Persian satraps rejected it with contempt. They were proud noblemen, and the idea of destroying their own rich estates was abhorrent to them. Furthermore, they considered it a matter of honor to defend their territory. They were deeply arrogant, confident that their superior numbers and legendary cavalry could easily crush this young upstart from the Macedonian backwoods. This pride, this refusal to heed the sound advice of their Greek mercenary, would cost them everything. They chose to make their stand at the banks of a small river called the Granicus, in May of 334 BC. The Persian army deployed in a strong defensive position on the steep eastern bank of the river. It was a formidable obstacle, with a swift current and muddy, treacherous banks. Confident in their horsemen, the Persians placed their elite cavalry in the front line, right at the river's edge. Their infantry, which included thousands of Greek mercenaries, were placed in reserve on the high ground behind the cavalry. This was a critical tactical error. It meant their best infantry would be mere spectators in the opening and most decisive phase of the battle. When the Macedonian army arrived in the late afternoon, Alexander's most experienced general, Parmenion, took one look at the situation and strongly advised caution. He urged Alexander to wait, to make camp, and to attempt a crossing at dawn, when the enemy might be less prepared. A frontal assault across a river, up a steep bank, and directly into the teeth of the enemy's best cavalry was, by any conventional military logic, suicidal. Alexander would have none of it. He dismissed Parmenion's concerns with a characteristic display of supreme confidence. "I should be ashamed of myself," he reportedly said, "if, after crossing the Hellespont, I should be afraid of this little ditch of a river." He knew that this first battle was about more than just territory. It was about psychology. He needed to demonstrate from the very beginning that his courage was boundless and his army was unstoppable. Hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. He ordered an immediate attack. He placed himself at the head of his elite companion cavalry on the right wing, his white-plumed helmet making him an unmistakable target, and led the charge himself. The cavalry plunged into the river, fighting the current and struggling for footing on the slick mud of the far bank. They were met by a furious countercharge from the Persian nobles. A chaotic and desperate melee erupted in the river and on its banks. Alexander was in the thick of it, fighting like one of Homer's heroes. His spear shattered against an enemy's armor. As he fought for his life, he was attacked by 2 Persian noblemen at once. The first, Rosaces, struck him a glancing blow on the head with his sword, shearing off his helmet's crest and cutting through to the scalp. Dazed, Alexander still managed to kill him with a thrust from a new spear. But as he did, the second Persian, Spithridates, raised his own sword from behind, preparing to deliver the final killing blow. In that split second, as the blade was about to fall, one of Alexander's officers, Clitus the Black, charged in from the side. With a single swing of his own sword, he severed Spithridates' arm at the shoulder, saving the king's life. This moment was the crisis point of the battle. With their leaders killed in the melee around Alexander, and shocked by the sheer ferocity of the Macedonian assault, the Persian cavalry line began to crumble. The Macedonians fought their way onto the bank, established a foothold, and soon the entire Persian front broke and fled. The battle then became a massacre. Alexander turned his attention to the thousands of Greek mercenaries who had been standing uselessly on the hill. As fellow Greeks fighting for the barbarians, he considered them traitors. He refused their pleas for surrender and had the majority of them slaughtered where they stood. The victory was absolute. In a single afternoon, Alexander had shattered Persian power in Asia Minor. He masterfully used the victory as propaganda, sending 300 suits of captured Persian armor back to Athens to be dedicated to the goddess Athena on the Parthenon. The inscription he ordered was a masterstroke of political messaging. Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks accept the Spartans from the barbarians who dwell in Asia. He was framing his personal conquest as a pan-Hellenic war, while simultaneously shaming his Spartan rivals. The path down the wealthy coast of Asia Minor was now wide open. After the victory at the Granicus, Alexander faced a critical strategic choice. The main Persian army, commanded by King Darius III himself, was gathering in the interior. The conventional military move would have been to march inland and seek a decisive battle. But Alexander was not a conventional commander. He understood that Persia's greatest strength was not its army, but its massive navy, which controlled the seas and could land troops behind his lines, cutting his supply routes and even inciting rebellion back in Greece. Alexander's own fleet was small and inferior. He knew he could not defeat the Persian navy at sea, so he decided to defeat it on land. His strategy was as brilliant as it was unorthodox. He would march south along the coast and capture every single port and naval base used by the Persian fleet. Without harbors, the enemy's ships would be homeless, unable to resupply or take shelter. The Persian navy would wither and die without a single major naval battle. He began his march down the coast of Ionia, the region of Greek cities in Asia Minor that had been under Persian rule for generations. He entered cities like Sardis and Ephesus not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He expelled the pro-Persian tyrants, restored democratic governments, and declared the cities free, winning the adoration of their people. He was not just a Macedonian king. He was fulfilling his role as the leader of a pan-Hellenic crusade. But this smooth progress came to a grinding halt before the city of Tyre. Tyre was the jewel of Phoenicia, the most powerful naval base in the entire eastern Mediterranean, and the heart of Persian sea power. It was also considered impregnable. The main city was built on an island, about half a mile, or 800 meters, from the coast, and was surrounded by colossal walls, some rising 150 feet directly from the sea. When Alexander demanded the city's surrender, the Tyrians laughed at him. With their complete command of the sea, they believed they could withstand any siege indefinitely. Alexander was faced with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. He could not take the city without a navy, and he could not build a navy without the loyalty of the coastal cities like Tyre. His response to this paradox is one of the greatest feats of military engineering in history. He decided that if he could not go to the island, He would bring the land to the island. He ordered his engineers to build a massive causeway, a land bridge 200 feet wide, across the sea, directly to the walls of Tyre. What followed was an epic 7-month siege, a testament to both Tyrian defiance and Macedonian determination. Tens of thousands of soldiers and laborers worked to build the causeway, dredging sand and dropping timber and stone into the sea. The Tyrians relentlessly harassed them. Their ships would sail close, firing arrows and catapult stones at the workers. Their swimmers would dive underwater to pull away the logs supporting the structure. In response, Alexander built 2 gigantic mobile siege towers, each 150 feet tall, and placed them at the end of the mole to protect his men. The Tyrians responded with a stroke of genius. They took an old horse transport ship, loaded it with highly combustible materials like pitch and sulfur, and hung cauldrons of oil from its masts. They waited for a strong wind, set the ship ablaze, and aimed the floating inferno directly at the causeway. The fire ship slammed into the 2 siege towers, which were engulfed in flames and destroyed. As the Macedonians reeled in shock, the Tyrian navy launched a full-scale raid to finish the job. Alexander's great causeway was a smoking ruin. Any other commander might have given up. But for Alexander, the word was not in his vocabulary. His will was absolute. He ordered the causeway to be rebuilt, this time even wider and stronger, and he set off to gather a fleet of his own. His recent victories had started a chain reaction. Other Phoenician cities like Sidon and Byblos, ancient rivals of Tyre, had surrendered to him, and their fleets now defected to his side. Soon, squadrons from Cyprus and Rhodes also joined his cause. By the time the new causeway was nearing the island, Alexander had assembled a war fleet of over 200 ships. He finally controlled the sea. The end came in July of 332 BC. With his new fleet blockading the Tyrian harbors and the completed causeway now bristling with the most powerful siege engines ever built, Alexander launched an all-out assault from land and sea. Catapults battered the walls from the mole, while ships equipped with battering rams slammed against the seaward defenses. A breach was finally made in the southern wall. Alexander, as always, led the charge himself, fighting his way into the city. The retribution for 7 months of defiance was horrific. 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting. Afterwards, Alexander had 2,000 more men of military age crucified along the coastline, a ghastly warning to any other city that dared to resist him. The remaining 30,000 inhabitants of the city were sold into slavery. After another brutal 2-month siege at Gaza, Alexander marched into Egypt. Here, the story was completely different. The Egyptians loathed their Persian overlords, who had insulted their religion and ruled with a heavy hand. They welcomed Alexander as a divine liberator. He entered the country without a single fight. The Persian governor simply handed over the treasury, and the Egyptian people hailed him as their new ruler. In the ancient capital of Memphis, the Egyptian priesthood, recognizing his power and his respect for their gods, crowned him with a double crown of the pharaohs. He was no longer just the king of Macedon and hegemon of Greece. He was now the master of the entire eastern Mediterranean, and a living god in the eyes of his new Egyptian subjects. Being hailed as a living god in Egypt had a profound effect on Alexander. It affirmed the whispers his mother had planted in his mind since childhood. This new divine status manifested in 2 extraordinary actions. The first was an act of creation. Traveling to the Mediterranean coast, he identified a strategic strip of land between a large lake and the sea. Here, with a founder's vision, he personally laid out the plans for a new city, using barley flour to trace the lines of its future walls. This was not just another military colony. This was to be Alexandria, a magnificent, perfectly planned metropolis designed to be the commercial and cultural crossroads of the world, a great bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was the first true expression of his dream of a fused cosmopolitan empire. a city that would outlast his conquests and become the intellectual capital of the ancient world. His second act was a journey inward, a deeply personal quest into the heart of the desert. Hundreds of miles west of the Nile, in the remote and desolate Siwa oasis, lay one of the most famous oracles of the ancient world, the Oracle of Zeus Ammon. The Greeks identified the Egyptian god Ammon with their own king of the gods, Zeus. Having been crowned pharaoh, the son of Ra, Alexander, who had been told his true father was Zeus, now sought confirmation from the god himself. The journey was perilous. He led a small party on a 300-mile trek across the unforgiving Libyan desert. They nearly died of thirst. Later legends, likely encouraged by Alexander himself, claimed they were saved by a miraculous, sudden downpour and then guided across the trackless sands by two divine serpents. When he finally reached the oasis, Alexander entered the inner sanctum of the temple alone to consult the oracle. No one knows for certain what was said in that sacred place. Alexander never revealed the full details. But when he emerged, he told his anxious companions only that he had received the answer his heart desired. It is widely believed that the high priest, in his formal greeting as Alexander entered, addressed him with the traditional title for a pharaoh, "O son of Ammon." For the priest, this was protocol. For Alexander, it was divine confirmation. He left Siwa no longer just the son of Philip, but in his own mind, the confirmed son of Zeus. This conviction would change everything, creating a subtle but widening gulf between him and his Macedonian soldiers, who revered him as their king but would never accept him as their god. This was the seed of future tragedy. Returning from the desert, a new message from the Persian king, Darius III, was waiting for him. The Persian king, having now lost the entire western portion of his empire, was desperate for a settlement. He made Alexander a staggering offer. He would cede all Persian territory west of the Euphrates River, offer the hand of his daughter in marriage, forming a royal alliance, and pay an enormous ransom for the return of his captured family. It was a deal that would have given Alexander an immense empire and made him the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. His senior general, the old and cautious Parmenion, was stunned by the offer. "If I were Alexander," the old man declared, "I would accept it." Alexander's famous reply reveals the terrifying scale of his ambition. "So would I," he shot back, "if I were Parmenion." He rejected the offer without a moment's hesitation. His written response to Darius was breathtaking in its arrogance. He declared that there could not be two suns in the sky, and there could not be two great kings on earth. He was not a rival monarch to be negotiated with. He was the new lord of all Asia, and Darius was his subject. Diplomacy was over. The only thing left to decide was who would rule the world. Spurned and humiliated, Darius gathered the full, terrifying might of his vast Eastern Empire for one final winner-take-all battle on a carefully chosen plain in Mesopotamia. The final confrontation was set. On a wide, flat plain near a village called Gaugamela, Darius III had gathered the grand army of his empire. This was not the regional force Alexander had faced before. This was the full might of Asia. Contingents had been drawn from every corner of the empire. Babylonians, Bactrians, fearsome Scythian cavalry from the steppes, and even a small contingent of Indian war elephants. Ancient sources wildly exaggerate the numbers, but modern historians believe Darius had assembled well over 100,000 men, outnumbering Alexander's army of 47,000 by at least 2 to 1. Darius had learned from his past mistakes. He had handpicked the battlefield, a vast plain perfect for his cavalry and chariots, and had even ordered the ground to be leveled to ensure their effectiveness. He was ready. The night before the battle, a stark contrast settled over the two camps. The Persian camp was a sea of light and noise. Fearing a surprise night attack, Darius had ordered his entire army to remain awake and in full battle formation all night. In the Macedonian camp, there was only darkness and quiet. Alexander, projecting an aura of supreme confidence, rejected Parmenian's suggestion of a night assault, declaring he would not steal a victory. He then went to his tent and slept so soundly that his generals had to wake him in the morning. As the sun rose on October 1st, 331 BC, the two armies faced each other. Alexander, seeing the immense length of the Persian line, knew he was in danger of being enveloped. He responded with a brilliant, unconventional formation. He angled his flanks backward, creating a reserve line that could swing around to protect his rear if he was surrounded. It was a flexible, dynamic formation designed to counter the Persian numbers. The battle began strangely. Alexander, commanding the right wing, did not advance straight ahead. Instead, he began to march his entire wing diagonally to the right, almost parallel to the Persian line. The Persian cavalry commander on their left wing, fearing he would be outflanked, had no choice but to follow, mirroring Alexander's movement. This stretched the Persian line, pulling it further and further to the side. Seeing his line becoming disorganized, Darius unleashed his ultimate weapon, the scythed chariots. But Alexander was prepared. He had trained his infantry for this exact moment. As the chariots thundered towards them, the frontline soldiers opened their ranks, creating channels. The chariots passed harmlessly through these gaps and were then attacked from the sides and rear by soldiers with javelins. The terrifying superweapon had been neutralized with barely a casualty. Meanwhile, Alexander's relentless sideways movement had finally created the opportunity he was looking for. As the Persian left wing stretched to keep up with him, a gap opened in their line, near the center where Darius himself stood, surrounded by his elite royal guard. This was the moment. Alexander instantly wheeled his companion cavalry into a giant wedge formation, and with a battle cry, led a thunderous charge directly into that gap, aiming for the heart of the enemy army, for Darius himself. The charge smashed through the Persian guard. The discipline and ferocity of the Macedonians were overwhelming. Darius, from his royal chariot, saw the demonic white-plumed helmet of Alexander getting closer and closer, a spear point aimed directly at him. For the second time in his life, terror seized the great king. He yanked the reins of his chariot, turned and fled the battlefield, abandoning his army to save his own life. The king's flight was the signal for the entire Persian center and left to collapse into a panicked rout. But the battle was not over. On the Macedonian left, old Parmenion was in desperate trouble, his wing being overwhelmed by the Persian right-wing cavalry. He sent an urgent message to Alexander for help. Alexander was faced with a soul-wrenching choice: to continue his pursuit of Darius and potentially capture him, ending the war at a stroke, or to turn back and save his men. He chose his men. He abandoned the chase and slammed into the rear of the victorious Persian right wing, shattering their attack and securing the complete victory. Darius had escaped, but his army was annihilated and his authority as great king was broken forever. Gaugamela was Alexander's masterpiece, a triumph of tactical genius and supreme nerve against overwhelming odds. The road to the great cities of the Persian Empire, Babylon, Susa, and the grand capital of Persepolis, now lay open. With the Persian army shattered at Gaugamela, the great cities of the empire lay defenseless before Alexander. The war of battles was over. The war of occupation had begun. He first marched south to the ancient city of Babylon, one of the wonders of the world. Expecting a fight, he was met instead with a celebration. The Babylonian people, who had long resented Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Flowers were thrown in his path, and the priests hailed him as their rightful king. Here, Alexander displayed the political genius that so often accompanied his military might. There were no reprisals, no looting. He showed profound respect for their ancient culture, ordering the restoration of the temples the Persians had damaged, and he personally made a sacrifice to Babylon's chief god, Marduk. He was not just conquering a city, he was winning a kingdom. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, one of the 4 capitals of the empire. Here, He captured the first great portion of the Persian imperial treasury. The amount of wealth was almost beyond comprehension. Tens of thousands of talents of gold and silver, a treasure so vast it would fund his ambitions for the next decade and fundamentally alter the economy of the ancient world. But his eyes were set on the ultimate prize, the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the Achaemenid dynasty, the grand city of Persepolis. This was not a city of commerce like Babylon. It was a statement. Its magnificent palaces, the Hall of 100 Columns, and the Grand Apodana staircase were built for one purpose: to awe the world with the power and majesty of the great king. It was a symbol of Persian glory, filled with the tribute and treasures gathered from 100 conquered nations. And it was here that Alexander's campaign of liberation took a much darker turn. After allowing his troops to plunder the city's riches, Alexander lingered at Persepolis for several months. Then, in an act that has been debated by historians for over 2 millennia, he destroyed it. The most famous account of the event, written by later historians, describes a wild night of drinking. At a banquet, an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who was the lover of his general Ptolemy, supposedly stood up and gave a speech. She declared that it would be a glorious act to burn down the palace of Xerxes, the king who had burned Athens to the ground 150 years earlier. It would be a fitting revenge, she argued, for a Greek woman to destroy the symbol of Persian pride. The idea, born of wine and passion, caught fire. The drunken Macedonians, including Alexander himself, grabbed torches and in a chaotic procession, they set the magnificent palace complex ablaze. They watched as the grand cedar roofs caught fire, the stone walls cracked in the heat, and the symbol of a 200-year-old dynasty collapsed into a mountain of ash and rubble. But was it truly just a drunken whim? Many historians believe it was a calculated act of political theater. It was the ultimate symbolic statement that the Achaemenid dynasty was finished. The war of Pan-Hellenic revenge was now officially over, its purpose fulfilled in the most dramatic way imaginable. By burning Persepolis, he was telling his Greek allies that their duty was done. It may also have been a brutal strategic message to the eastern provinces of the empire. Resistance was futile, because the old order was not just defeated, but completely erased. Whatever the motive, the burning of Persepolis marks a turning point in Alexander's character. The brilliant, disciplined general of Gaugamela was now also a man capable of astonishing, almost nihilistic acts of destruction. He had conquered the Persian capitals, he had seized the greatest treasury on earth, and he had burned the heart of the empire to the ground. But the war was not truly over in his mind. One loose end remained. King Darius III, the fugitive, was still alive, having fled eastward into the remote provinces of his collapsing empire. For Alexander, who could not tolerate a rival, the conquest would not be complete until the last Persian king was dead. His next campaign would not be a war of armies, but a relentless, obsessive pursuit. The conqueror now became the hunter. The conqueror had become the hunter. The pursuit of Darius III consumed Alexander with an obsessive energy. He drove his army eastward across the harsh, arid landscapes of northern Persia in a series of punishing forced marches, pushing his men to the absolute limits of their endurance. This was no longer a strategic campaign. It was a personal quest. Alexander understood that as long as Darius lived, he remained a symbol of resistance, a legitimate king on the run. To truly own the Persian Empire, Alexander needed to either capture him alive and receive a formal surrender, or eliminate him as a rival. He needed to possess the throne, not just occupy it. As Alexander's relentless pursuit closed in, the loyalty around the fugitive Persian king began to collapse. Darius's own nobles and generals, led by a powerful satrap from the eastern province of Bactria named Bessus, saw their king as a failure. He had fled from 2 decisive battles, abandoning his armies and his honor. They believed he was now a liability. A conspiracy was formed. They argued that if they surrendered Darius to Alexander, they might receive favorable treatment. Or if they removed him and fought on under new, more determined leadership, they might yet save the eastern half of the empire. Their loyalty to the dynasty was dead, replaced by the instinct for self-preservation. The conspirators seized Darius and held him prisoner, continuing their flight eastward. When Alexander received intelligence that Darius had been betrayed, the hunt became even more frantic. In a final, desperate dash, he took only his fastest cavalry and a small contingent of infantry and rode relentlessly, covering vast distances with almost no rest. He was too late. When he finally caught up to the Persian baggage train, he found a scene of chaos. Bessus and the other conspirators, hearing Alexander's approach, had stabbed their king and fled, leaving him for dead in a covered wagon. According to the historian Plutarch, Alexander arrived just as the last Achaemenid king was breathing his last. He found the once mighty ruler of the largest empire on earth bleeding out in a humble ox cart. In a gesture of respect, Alexander is said to have removed his own cloak and covered the body of his fallen rival. He later gave Darius a magnificent royal funeral and buried him with full honors in the tombs of the Persian kings at Persepolis. But this was more than just a moment of chivalry. It was a masterful political act. He vowed to hunt down the assassins, positioning himself not as Darius's enemy, but as his legitimate avenger and successor. By honoring the dead king, he was laying claim to his throne. With the death of Darius, the original justification for the war, the Pan-Hellenic Crusade of Revenge, was officially over. The Persian king was dead, his capitals were captured, and the symbol of his empire was a smoking ruin. For the Greek soldiers and for many of the Macedonian veterans, the war was won. They had fulfilled their duty, and they were now rich beyond their wildest dreams. It was time to go home. But for Alexander, the war had just begun. In his mind, he was no longer the hegemon of Greece. He was now the great king of Asia, and he intended to conquer every last corner of his new domain, right to the very edge of the known world. This fundamental conflict of purpose, between an army that wanted to enjoy its victory and a king who saw victory as just the beginning, would define the rest of his life. His transformation was immediate and jarring to his men. He began to adopt the customs of the Persian court. He wore the flowing, regal Persian-style robes, included Persian nobles in his inner circle, and began to structure his court with the elaborate ceremony of an Eastern monarch. And then he attempted to introduce the single most controversial custom of all, proskynesis. This was the Persian court ritual of approaching the king and prostrating oneself on the ground before him. To the Persians, this was a standard gesture of deep respect for a divinely ordained ruler. To the Macedonians and Greeks, it was an abomination. They were proud men who viewed themselves as the king's companions, not his subjects. They would bow their heads in respect, but full prostration on the ground was an act of worship reserved for the gods alone. To perform it for a mortal man, even their own brilliant king, was slavish, blasphemous, and profoundly un-Macedonian. The resistance was immediate and fierce. His own soldiers, men who had bled for him and would gladly die for him in battle, refused to grovel before him like slaves. The old war against Persia was over, but a new, more dangerous conflict was just beginning. It was not a war against a foreign army, but a war of culture and identity within his own camp. Alexander's burning desire to fuse his two worlds, to rule as an absolute, godlike emperor, was putting him on a direct collision course with the very men who had made his conquests possible. His transformation from Macedonian king to Asian emperor was creating deep, dangerous cracks in the foundations of his army, cracks that would soon erupt into conspiracy, betrayal, and murder. As Alexander pushed his unwilling army deeper into the rugged eastern provinces of Bactria and Sogdia, relentlessly hunting the usurper Bessus, the cultural conflict within his camp began to fester. The grumbling of the Macedonian veterans against his adoption of Persian customs and his divine pretensions grew louder. Alexander, in turn, grew more autocratic and less tolerant of dissent. The atmosphere in the camp became thick with suspicion and paranoia. It was in this poisonous environment that the cracks in his army finally erupted into open conspiracy. The first major plot centered on a man named Philotas. He was the commander of the elite companion cavalry, a decorated soldier, but also an arrogant man known for his lavish lifestyle. More importantly, he was the son of Parmenion, Alexander's most senior general, the last great commander from Philip's generation. The family was immensely powerful and respected. Philotas had been openly critical of Alexander's new ways, complaining that the king was forgetting he was Macedonian. In the autumn of 330 BC, a minor plot to assassinate Alexander was uncovered. During the investigation, it was revealed that Philotas had been informed of the plot but had failed to report it to Alexander. For 2 days, he said nothing. When confronted, he claimed the source was unreliable and he didn't want to bother the king with trivial rumors. For Alexander's rivals at court, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. They immediately accused Philotas not just of negligence, but of treason. They argued he had deliberately kept the plot secret, waiting to see if it would succeed. A trial was held before the entire Macedonian army assembly. It was less a legal proceeding and more an act of political theater. Philotas defended himself, but Alexander personally delivered a powerful speech against him, painting him as an arrogant traitor. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Philotas was found guilty, tortured to extract a confession, in which he also implicated his father, Parmenion, and then executed by the army. The execution of Philotas created a terrifying new problem for Alexander. He had just killed the son of his most powerful and respected general. Parmenion, who was hundreds of miles away guarding the army's vast treasury at Ecbatana, was still in command of a large and loyal force. What would this 70-year-old veteran do when he learned that Alexander had tortured and killed his last surviving son? Alexander could not risk Parmenion seeking revenge. He could not afford a civil war. So, he made a decision of chilling ruthlessness. He dispatched a team of assassins on racing camels, carrying 2 letters. The first was a forged letter, supposedly from the now-dead Philotas. The second was a death warrant. The assassins crossed the desert at incredible speed, reaching Parmenion before the news of his son's execution. They found the old general, the man who had served Philip and then Alexander with unwavering loyalty for decades, walking in his garden. They gave him the forged letter. As the old man's face lit up at the sight of what he thought was his son's handwriting, the assassins drew their daggers and stabbed him to death. The murder of Parmenion was a watershed moment. Alexander had not just eliminated a potential threat. He had murdered his father's most trusted friend and his own most experienced general without charge or trial. A line had been crossed. The old camaraderie of the Macedonian court was dead, replaced by the cold fear of an absolute monarch. Men who had once spoken their minds freely now chose their words with care, wondering who might be listening. Alexander had secured his power with terror, but he had poisoned the well of loyalty that had sustained him. The resentment among his veterans now simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for another chance to explode. The murder of Parmenion had replaced the army's camaraderie with a quiet, simmering fear. As Alexander dragged his men through a grueling and frustrating guerrilla war in the eastern provinces of Sogdia and Bactria, this resentment continued to build. The soldiers were exhausted, fighting a bloody counterinsurgency campaign against fierce mountain tribes, thousands of miles from home. It was in this tense and weary atmosphere, in the autumn of 328 BC, that the conflict between Alexander's past and his present would finally explode in an act of shocking personal violence. The victim was Clitus the Black. He was not just another general. He was a pillar of the Macedonian Old Guard, the brother of Alexander's childhood nurse, Launike, and a man who had fought loyally for both Philip and his son. Most importantly, he was the man who had personally saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, severing the arm of the Persian noble who was about to deliver a killing blow. He was a blunt, proud, and fiercely traditional Macedonian who was not afraid to speak his mind, even to the king. The tragedy unfolded at a banquet in the city of Maracanda. As was the Macedonian custom, the drinking was heavy. The evening began with sycophants and flatterers showering Alexander with praise, comparing him to the gods and belittling the achievements of his father, Philip. Clitus, who had served Philip with honor, grew increasingly angry at this disrespect. Drunk and belligerent, he began to argue back, loudly defending Philip's legacy and reminding the court that it was the veterans of Philip's army who formed the backbone of their success. The argument quickly escalated, becoming more heated and personal. Alexander, his own pride stung and his judgment clouded by wine, began to mock Clitus. Clitus, in turn, finally unleashed all his pent-up frustration. He openly criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian dress, his embrace of barbarian customs, and his preference for foreign flatterers over his own loyal Macedonian companions. In his rage, he held up his right hand, the hand that had saved the king's life, and shouted, "This is the hand, Alexander, that saved you at the Granicus." It was a terrible insult, a public reminder that the great king had once been weak and vulnerable, a debt that Alexander, in his growing arrogance, could not bear. That was the breaking point. Blinded by an uncontrollable rage, Alexander leaped from his couch, screaming for his personal guards. His more sober commanders, desperate to prevent a tragedy, restrained him while others physically dragged the still shouting Clitus out of the room. But the chaos was not over. Alexander, breaking free, roared for a weapon. At the same moment, Clitus, equally stubborn and drunk, stormed back into the room to have the last word. Alexander snatched a spear from a nearby guard. As his lifelong friend, the man who had saved him, stood before him, the Lord of Asia ran him through, killing him instantly. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. In an instant, Alexander's drunken fury evaporated, replaced by a wave of horrified clarity. He saw Clitus's body on the floor, the spear protruding from his chest, and he understood what he had done. He pulled the spear from his friend's corpse and tried to turn it on himself, but his bodyguards wrestled it from his grasp. For the next 3 days, Alexander locked himself in his tent, consumed by a suicidal grief. He refused all food and drink, weeping uncontrollably, calling himself the murderer of his friends. He was only coaxed out when his advisors, desperate to restore order, convinced the army to pass a decree stating that Clitus had been justly killed for treason, a political fiction designed to absolve the king of a crime that could never be erased. The murder of Clitus the Black was more than a drunken brawl. It was the physical manifestation of the war raging inside Alexander himself, the war between his Macedonian past and his Persian future, between the loyal companion and the absolute monarch. He had killed the man who had saved his life, and in doing so had killed a vital part of his own history. The murder of Clitus the Black left a deep and ugly scar on the Macedonian army. The bond of trust between the king and his oldest companions was broken, replaced by fear and a growing resentment. Alexander, perhaps sensing this dangerous rift and needing to refocus his men on a common goal, turned his eyes eastward once more. Having finally crushed the rebellions in the eastern provinces of Bactria and Sogdia, a campaign that culminated in the capture of the supposedly impregnable Sogdian rock and his political marriage to the beautiful Bactrian noblewoman Roxana, he now looked for a new world to conquer. That world was India. Why India? For Alexander, it was the logical next step in his insatiable quest for glory, a quest driven by that deep yearning the Greeks called pothos. He had conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire, but his ambition was not satisfied. In the limited geography of the Greek world, India was believed to be the last land on the eastern edge of the earth. Beyond it, they thought, lay the great outer ocean that encircled the world. To reach that ocean was to reach the end, to have literally conquered everything. Furthermore, he was chasing myths. The gods Heracles and Dionysus, from whom he claimed descent, were both said to have campaigned in India. To surpass their legendary deeds was to cement his own claim to divinity. In the summer of 327 BC, he led his army of veterans and new Asian recruits across the formidable Hindu Kush Mountains, a grueling passage through snowy peaks that rivaled Hannibal's later crossing of the Alps. They descended into the valleys of modern-day Pakistan and into a world unlike any they had ever seen. India was a land of incredible wealth, dense jungles, strange customs, and a patchwork of fiercely independent kingdoms, or rajas. Many of the local rulers, awed by the size and discipline of Alexander's army, submitted to him, offering gifts and allegiance. But not all would bend the knee. In the fertile region of the Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, ruled a proud and powerful king named Porus. A giant of a man said to stand nearly 7 feet tall, Porus was a formidable warrior with a formidable army. When Alexander sent a demand for his submission, Porus sent back a defiant reply. He would meet Alexander at his border, but he would meet him armed for battle. He gathered his forces, infantry, cavalry, chariots, and his kingdom's ultimate weapon, a terrifying corps of some 200 war elephants, and positioned them on the eastern bank of the Hydaspes River, daring Alexander to cross. By the time Alexander reached the Hydaspes in the spring of 326 BC, the situation looked grim. The river was wide and swollen, its current made treacherous by the beginning of the monsoon season. A direct, opposed crossing against Porus's army seemed impossible. The Macedonian horses, in particular, were terrified of the sight and smell of the elephants on the far bank and refused to go near them. For weeks, the two armies faced each other across the raging river in a tense standoff. Alexander rode up and down his side of the bank, making feints and loudly discussing crossing plans to keep Porus's army guessing and constantly on edge. But Porus matched him, moving his elephants to counter every potential crossing point. Alexander, the master of the pitched battle and the unstoppable siege, was faced with a tactical problem unlike any he had ever encountered. His entire Indian campaign, and his unbroken record of victory, now depended on him finding a way to outwit the proud Indian king and his army of elephants. For weeks, the two armies faced each other across the raging Hydaspes River. Alexander knew a direct assault would be a disaster. He needed to outthink Porus to use deception on a grand scale. He began a brilliant war of nerves. Night after night, he would march his troops up and down the riverbank, loudly giving orders and making obvious preparations for a crossing. Porus would dutifully move his army, including his elephants, to counter each feint. After many nights of these false alarms, the Indian sentries grew weary and less responsive, believing Alexander was merely trying to wear them down. This was exactly what he wanted. Under the cover of a severe thunderstorm on a moonless night, Alexander made his move. Leaving a large portion of his army under his general Craterus at the main camp with instructions to make as much noise as possible, Alexander led his elite strike force on a forced march 17 miles upstream. He had chosen his crossing point well, a wooded headland that obscured his movements from the opposite bank. In the driving rain and crashing thunder, his best troops began the perilous crossing on makeshift rafts and boats. They were discovered by Indian scouts, but it was too late. Porus, hearing of the landing but still unsure if it was the main assault or another diversion, sent his son with a small force of cavalry and chariots to intercept them. Alexander, who had already established a beachhead, led his own cavalry and annihilated the smaller Indian force. Porus's son was killed. Now the Indian king knew the truth. This was the real threat. In a difficult tactical decision, he left a small detachment to keep Craterus pinned down at the main camp and marched with the bulk of his army and his entire elephant corps to confront Alexander on the field of battle. When the two armies finally met, the Macedonians faced a terrifying spectacle. Porus had arranged his 200 war elephants in a single line at the front, like living battlements, with his infantry packed in the gaps between them. His cavalry guarded the flanks. The ground shuddered as the elephants charged, crashing into the Macedonian phalanx with terrifying force. The infantry line bent and buckled. The elephants seized men with their trunks, tossing them into the air or trampling them underfoot. The disciplined phalanx, for the first time in its history, was on the verge of breaking. But Alexander was not fighting the elephants. His plan was to defeat the army around them. He did not engage Porus's center. Instead, he took his elite companion cavalry and launched a massive, overwhelming assault on the Indian left flank. The Indian cavalry, no match for the Macedonians, was shattered and driven back. Alexander then sent his horse archers to rain arrows on the elephants' flanks, and ordered his infantry not to attack the great beasts themselves, but their riders, the mahouts. This was the key to victory. As the mahouts were killed by javelins and arrows, the elephants, without their guides, began to panic. Wounded and enraged, they became uncontrollable, rampaging through the battlefield. They no longer distinguished between friend and foe, trampling and goring Porus's own infantry as they tried to retreat. The battle dissolved into a bloody chaos of panicked men and maddened animals. The Macedonian phalanx, recovering its discipline, reformed into a solid wall of spears, pressing forward and compacting the terrified Indian infantry around the rampaging elephants, creating a horrifying killing ground. At that moment, Craterus, seeing that the main battle was won, began his own crossing downstream, bringing thousands of fresh troops to slam into the rear of the already broken Indian army. The encirclement was complete. Porus, fighting with incredible courage from atop his lead elephant, wounded but unbowed, saw his army being annihilated. He continued to fight until, surrounded and with no hope left, he was finally persuaded to surrender. Alexander, who had watched the king's bravery with admiration, rode out to meet his captured rival. "How do you wish to be treated?" Alexander asked. Porus, tall and proud even in defeat, gave a reply that would become legendary. "Treat me, Alexander, as a king." In a stunning act of statesmanship, Alexander did just that. He not only restored Porus to his throne but also granted him more territory, turning a defiant enemy into his most powerful and loyal ally in India. The Battle of the Hydaspes was a tactical masterpiece, perhaps Alexander's greatest. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. The psychological shock of fighting the war elephants had shaken his army to its core. They had defeated the mighty Porus, but their will to march further into the unknown was beginning to crumble. The victory over Porus, as magnificent as it was, proved to be a breaking point. The battle against the war elephants had been a brutal, terrifying experience that had shaken the Macedonian army to its core. They were now deep in a strange alien land, and the monsoon season had descended upon them, bringing with it relentless torrential rain. The atmosphere in the camp was one of exhaustion and grim anxiety. But Alexander was relentless. Having made Porus a powerful ally, his gaze was already fixed on the next prize. He heard tales from local guides of the lands further east, of the mighty Ganges River, and of the powerful Nanda Empire that was said to possess armies that dwarfed even that of the Persians, with thousands of war elephants. For Alexander, whose pot-hose, his yearning for the unknown, was insatiable, this was an irresistible challenge. For his men, it was a vision of hell. They had been campaigning for 8 years. They had marched more than 11,000 miles from their homes. Their boots were worn, their armor was battered, and their bodies were scarred. They were rich with plunder, but they were spiritually and physically exhausted. They longed to see their wives, their children, and their homeland. They had conquered the Persian Empire, the greatest the world had ever known. They had done everything their king had asked of them and more. And now he wanted them to march into a swampy, disease-ridden land to fight even larger armies and more terrifying beasts. The breaking point came at the banks of the Hephaestion River, the modern Bias. Here, the army finally stopped. It was not a violent uprising. It was a quiet, stubborn, and collective refusal. The soldiers would go no further. Alexander, disbelieving, called an assembly of his officers and delivered one of the most passionate speeches of his life. He spoke of their past glories, of the shame of turning back now, of the immortal fame that awaited them at the shores of the great outer ocean, which he believed was just a few weeks' march away. He tried to reignite the fire that had carried them across the known world. When he finished, there was a long, painful silence. No one dared to be the first to defy him. Finally, Caenus, a senior and highly respected veteran commander, stood up to be the voice of the army. His speech was a masterpiece of respectful defiance. He began by recounting the army's unwavering loyalty and their many victories. But then he spoke of their losses, of the men who had died, and of the exhaustion of those who remained. He spoke of their longing for home, of their desire to enjoy the fruits of their victories with the families they had not seen in a decade. A commander's glory is greatest, he concluded, when he brings his victorious soldiers safely home. As he finished, the common soldiers wept and shouted their approval. The will of the army was clear. This was the one battle Alexander could not win. He was furious, humiliated that his men no longer shared his ambition. He retreated to his tent and for 3 days refused to see anyone, a silent protest in the hope that his men would relent. But the army waited. Their decision was made. Finally, on the 4th day, Alexander emerged. In a classic face-saving gesture, he announced that he had taken the sacred omens, and they were unfavorable for crossing the river. The army would turn back. The camp erupted in a cathartic explosion of joy. The hardened veterans, who had faced down Persian cavalry and Indian elephants, wept with relief. They rushed to Alexander's tent, hailing him as their greatest commander, the only one who had ever allowed himself to be conquered by the love of his own men. At the banks of the Hephaestion, they built 12 massive altars to the gods, monuments to the furthest point of their advance. Alexander had conquered kings, cities, and empires, but he could not conquer the collective will of his own exhausted soldiers. The great eastward march was over. The long and, as it would turn out, devastating journey home was about to begin. Alexander had been turned back by his own men, but he was not a man to simply retrace his steps. The journey home would not be a retreat, but a new brutal campaign of conquest and exploration. He ordered the construction of a massive fleet, 1,000 ships strong, to carry part of his army down the great Indus River to the Indian Ocean, the southern edge of the world. As the fleet sailed, the rest of the army marched along the banks, waging a merciless war on the tribes of the Indus Valley who had not yet submitted. This was not a campaign of liberation. It was a campaign of terror, designed to ensure that no one would dare to rise up after he had gone. The fighting was savage, culminating in a campaign against the fierce Malian people. Here, Alexander's impatience and reckless courage nearly cost him his life. Frustrated with the slow progress of a siege, he grabbed a ladder and was the first man over the city wall, accompanied by only 2 or 3 of his bodyguards. The ladder shattered behind him, leaving the king of Asia trapped alone inside the enemy fortress. He and his companions fought with desperate courage, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. An arrow, nearly a yard long, pierced Alexander's chest, puncturing his lung. He collapsed, gasping for breath. His bodyguards, notably a man named Peucestes who shielded him with the sacred shield from Troy, defended his fallen body. Below, the Macedonian army, realizing their king was trapped, went into a frenzy. They smashed down the city gates, swarmed into the city, and in their grief and rage, massacred every man, woman, and child they could find. Alexander survived, though the wound would trouble him for the rest of his life. After months of more brutal fighting, the army finally reached the mouth of the Indus. They had arrived at the Indian Ocean. For the Macedonians, many of whom had never even seen the sea before leaving home, the sight of the vast tidal ocean was a profound, almost religious experience. They had reached the end of the world. Alexander made grand sacrifices to the sea god, Poseidon, and celebrated with his men. Here, at the shores of the ocean, he made the most fateful logistical decision of his career. He would split his forces for the return journey to the heart of his empire in Persia. His admiral, Nearchus, would command the fleet on a pioneering voyage of exploration, sailing west through the unknown ocean and charting a sea route to the Persian Gulf. A large portion of the army, under the reliable General Craterus, would take a safer, well-established inland route. Alexander himself, in what he saw as an act of solidarity and a final great challenge, would lead the main body of the army, including the veterans, cavalry, and thousands of women and children following the camp, on a direct march west along the coast. His plan was to supply the fleet from the land as it sailed. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The land he intended to march through was not a fertile coastline. It was the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most desolate and inhospitable wastelands on the planet. The plan to supply the fleet was impossible. The army could barely supply itself. What followed was not a march, but a 60-day descent into hell. The sun was relentless, the heat unbearable. The desert yielded no food and almost no water. The guides lost their way in the vast, shifting dunes. Men, women, children, and thousands of pack animals began to die of heatstroke and dehydration. Discipline, the bedrock of the Macedonian army, dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. Soldiers, maddened with thirst, would kill each other for a sip of water from a muddy hole. At night, flash floods would roar down dry riverbeds, sweeping away tents and sleeping soldiers without warning. The army that had conquered the world was being destroyed by nature itself. In this ultimate crisis, Alexander showed the leadership that had inspired such devotion. He refused all privilege. He dismounted his horse and marched on foot with his soldiers under the blistering sun. One day, a group of his scouts found a tiny pool of brackish water and brought a helmetful to their king. The entire army watched as he took the helmet. He thanked the men, and then, in front of everyone, he slowly poured the precious water onto the burning sand. If there was not enough for every man to drink, he declared, then he would drink none himself. The effect was electric. A cheer went up from the parched throats of his soldiers. They had a king who was truly sharing their suffering. The act gave them the morale to keep going. But it could not stop the dying. The army that finally staggered out of the Gedrosian Desert and into the fertile lands of Persia was a skeletal, traumatized shadow of its former self. Perhaps as many as 3/4 of those who had entered the desert never came out. It was the single greatest disaster of Alexander's career, a catastrophe born of his own ambition and ignorance. He had conquered the world, but he had led his army through the valley of death to do it. When Alexander and the skeletal remains of his army finally staggered out of the Gedrosian Desert, he returned to the heart of his empire to find it in chaos. In the years he had been away in the Far East, many had come to believe he would never return. A rumor of his death during the Malian siege had spread like wildfire. Thinking themselves unaccountable, many of the satraps, the governors he had left in charge, both Macedonian and Persian, had grown corrupt and arrogant. They had embezzled from the treasury, terrorized the local populations, and had begun raising private armies to carve out their own little kingdoms. Alexander's response was immediate and merciless. He unleashed a great purge, a reign of terror designed to brutally re-establish his absolute authority. There were no trials, no appeals. Powerful governors who had ruled vast territories were summarily arrested, charged with treason, and executed. He made it terrifyingly clear that there was only one king in this empire. His long absence was over, and anyone who had betrayed his trust would pay the ultimate price. Once order was restored through fear, Alexander turned to his grandest vision. His goal was not simply to rule a conquered Persia with a Macedonian fist. He dreamed of something far more radical: the fusion of the two cultures. He wanted to create a new, blended Greco-Persian ruling class that would govern the empire together. To achieve this, in the spring of 324 BC, he staged one of the most extraordinary events in history: the Great Susa Weddings. In a magnificent week-long festival, he himself married two Persian princesses of the highest royal blood: Statira, the eldest daughter of the defeated King Darius, and Persides, the daughter of a previous Persian king. By marrying the daughters of his enemies, he was symbolically healing the wounds of the war and grafting himself onto the ancient Achaemenid dynasty. But he didn't stop there. He then compelled over 80 of his most senior Macedonian commanders and companions to marry the daughters of the highest-ranking Persian noble families. The message was unmistakable: the futures of the two peoples were now to be intertwined. As a further incentive, he formally recognized the marriages of over 10,000 of his common soldiers who had taken Asian wives and rewarded each of them with a handsome dowry. For the Macedonian nobles, however, this forced union was a profound shock. They were proud men who had spent a decade fighting and bleeding to conquer Persia. Now, they were being ordered to marry the daughters of their defeated enemies. It felt less like a celebration and more like a betrayal of their Macedonian identity. Another sign that their king was becoming more Persian than Greek. This simmering resentment erupted into open mutiny a few months later at the city of Opis on the Tigris River. Alexander gathered the army and announced his plan to finally send the oldest and most wounded of his Macedonian veterans home, loaded with honors and wealth. But he also announced his intention to replace them with 30,000 newly trained Persian youths, integrated directly into the ranks of the phalanx. For the Macedonians, this was the ultimate insult. They were being replaced by the very people they had conquered. The army exploded in anger. They shouted for him to discharge them all. One soldier sarcastically cried out that he should go and fight his wars alone with his father, a pointed reference to the god Ammon, mocking Alexander's claim to divinity. This was not the quiet refusal of the Indian Mutiny. This was loud, open, and personal defiance. Alexander, consumed by a volcanic rage, leaped from the speaking platform. He pointed into the crowd, identifying 13 of the loudest ringleaders, and ordered his personal bodyguards to arrest them on the spot. The men were seized and immediately executed without trial. A horrified silence fell over the 20,000 remaining soldiers. Alexander climbed back onto the platform and delivered the most furious and emotional speech of his life. He shamed them, recounting his entire history with them, from his father Philip finding them as poor shepherds to him leading them to the riches of Asia. He listed his own many battle wounds, contrasting his sacrifice with their ingratitude. "Go home," he screamed, "and tell them how you deserted your king." He then shut himself in his palace for 2 days, refusing to see any of them. On the third day, he summoned the Persian commanders and announced that he was forming entirely new Persian army units, giving them Macedonian military titles, and making them his new royal family. That act finally broke the Macedonians. Faced with the humiliating reality of being completely replaced, their pride shattered. They gathered outside the palace, weeping, throwing down their weapons, and begging for forgiveness. A tearful reconciliation followed, culminating in a great feast where thousands of Macedonian and Persian soldiers sat and drank together. Alexander prayed aloud for homonoia, harmony and partnership between the two peoples. Through a masterful and terrifying combination of brutality, emotional manipulation, and political theater, he had crushed the last resistance of his army. He was now, truly, the undisputed emperor of two worlds. With his army finally united behind his vision of a fused empire, Alexander stood at the apex of his power. He had overcome every external enemy and crushed every internal dissent. But just as he reached this peak, fate delivered its cruelest and most personal blow. The one battle Alexander could never win was against death itself. The victim was his lifelong companion, his most trusted general, and the love of his life, Hephaestion. Hephaestion had been with Alexander since they were boys studying under Aristotle at Mysa. He was the one person who understood the man behind the crown. Alexander himself once famously explained their bond by saying, "Craterus is a friend of the king, but Hephaestion is a friend of Alexander." He was Alexander's Patroclus to his Achilles, his other self. In the autumn of 324 BC, the royal court was in the Persian city of Ecbatana, enjoying a season of festivals and athletic games. The mood was celebratory. In the midst of these festivities, Hephaestion fell ill with a high fever, most likely typhoid. Alexander was frantic with worry. He stayed by his friend's side, but as Hephaestion's condition seemed to improve under a doctor's care, Alexander left to attend the games. Hephaestion, feeling better and notoriously undisciplined, ignored his doctor's orders for a strict diet. He consumed a large meal of boiled chicken and drank a cooler of wine. He suffered a violent relapse and died before Alexander could be summoned back to his bedside. Alexander's reaction was not mere grief. It was a cataclysmic collapse of his entire world. He reportedly lay weeping over Hephaestion's body for a full day and night, refusing to be moved until he was carried away by his companions. His despair then turned into a terrifying, world-altering rage. He had the unfortunate doctor crucified. He ordered his own hair to be cut short in the Greek style of deep mourning. In a shocking decree, he commanded that the manes and tails of all the army's horses and mules be docked as well, so that even the animals would share in his grief. His most dramatic act was to command that the sacred flames, kept perpetually burning in temples across the empire, be extinguished. This was a right reserved only for the death of the great king himself. In doing this, Alexander was sending a message to the entire world. With Hephaestion gone, the world was now dark. His grief even took on a horrifying military dimension. He led a savage campaign against a nearby mountain tribe, the Cassians, massacring them and dedicating the slaughter as a funeral offering to the spirit of Hephaestion. He began to plan the most magnificent funeral in history. He ordered the construction of a colossal funeral pyre in Babylon, a structure said to be over 200 feet tall, a multi-tiered ziggurat of gold and purple that would cost a fortune equivalent to billions of dollars today. He sent a message to the Oracle of Siwa, the same oracle that had confirmed his own divinity, asking if it was permissible to worship Hephaestion as a god. The oracle gave a more measured reply, declaring that he could be worshipped not as a god, but as a divine hero. For Alexander, the light of his life had gone out. The vibrant, forward-looking conqueror obsessed with the future was replaced by a grieving man obsessed with honoring the dead. He returned to Babylon to oversee the preparations for the great funeral, but he was a hollowed-out, changed man. He was entering the final dark chapter of his own life. Alexander arrived in Babylon a changed man, a king shrouded in grief. To combat the all-consuming sorrow he felt for Hephaestion's death, he threw himself into his work with a feverish intensity. His ambition, even in mourning, remained boundless. He laid out plans for a series of staggering new campaigns. The circumnavigation and conquest of the Arabian Peninsula, to be followed by a grand expedition west to take on the rising powers of Carthage and Rome. He oversaw vast engineering projects and continued with the monumental, ruinously expensive construction of Hephaestion's funeral pyre. He was trying to outrun his own grief, to bury his personal loss under the weight of new imperial ambitions. In late May of 323 BC, the great funeral for Hephaestion was finally held. After the official period of mourning was over, Alexander attended a banquet hosted by one of his friends. As was his custom, the night involved heavy drinking. He stayed late into the night, and when he finally returned to his palace, he complained of feeling unwell. He had developed a fever. At first, no one was overly concerned. But the fever did not break. Day after day, it grew steadily worse. He was soon racked by agonizing pains and uncontrollable shivering. The business of the vast empire ground to a halt as the court waited anxiously for the king's legendary constitution to overcome the illness. But it did not. He grew weaker, soon becoming unable to walk, having to be carried on a litter to perform his daily sacrifices to the gods. Then he lost his ability to speak. The unconquerable king was being defeated by an invisible enemy within his own body. The true cause of his death remains one of the greatest mysteries in history. The ancient sources, and many modern historians, favor natural causes. The swampy, mosquito-infested environment of Babylon made malaria a likely culprit. Typhoid fever, contracted from contaminated food or water, is another strong possibility. His body was also worn down by years of campaigning and numerous serious wounds, and his legendary capacity for alcohol may have led to acute pancreatitis. But another, darker theory has persisted for centuries: that the king was poisoned. The primary suspect in this version of events was Antipater. The old and powerful regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedon. Alexander had recently grown suspicious of Antipater and had summoned him to Babylon, a summons Antipater rightly feared might be a death sentence. Just before Alexander fell ill, Antipater's son, Cassander, had arrived at court and had a bitter public argument with the king. The theory goes that Cassander, fearing for his family's survival, smuggled a deadly, slow-acting poison to the king, perhaps in the wine served at that final banquet. While it remains a dramatic possibility, most historians agree that disease is the more probable cause. As the days passed and it became clear that Alexander was dying, a panic began to grip the Macedonian army. These were the men who had followed him to the edge of the world. He was more than a king to them. He was the center of their universe. They demanded the right to see him one last time. The generals agreed. In a profoundly moving scene, the doors to the palace were opened, and the army, his veterans, filed silently past their dying commander's bed. Alexander was conscious but paralyzed and mute. He could only acknowledge each of his loyal soldiers with a slight nod or a flicker of his eyes. Finally, as the end drew near, his most senior commanders gathered around his bed. They asked him the question upon which the fate of the world now depended: "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" The story, which brings us full circle, is that Alexander, with his last breath, whispered the two words that would unleash 40 years of war: "Toi kratistoi," to the strongest. He then supposedly handed his signet ring, the symbol of his authority, to his general Perdiccas. Shortly after, on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC, just a month shy of his 33rd birthday, Alexander the Great was dead. The man who had conquered the world had been conquered by a fever. His death did not bring peace. It unleashed chaos. Alexander's death created a power vacuum that tore the world apart. His final prophecy, that his empire would belong to the strongest, was fulfilled with horrifying brutality. His vast dominion, held together by the force of his singular personality, had no viable heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant with a son, and he had an intellectually disabled half-brother, but there was no one who could command the loyalty of his fiercely ambitious generals. They were lions who had served a greater lion. Now that he was gone, they would not bow to a cub. Almost immediately, his top commanders began to circle each other, plotting and scheming to carve up the largest empire the world had ever seen. These men, the Diadochi or successors, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Cassander, had conquered the world together. Now they would spend the rest of their lives trying to conquer each other. The death of Alexander did not bring peace. It unleashed 40 years of savage, unrelenting warfare that stretched from Greece to the borders of India. The very Macedonian veterans who had stood side by side at Gaugamela now slaughtered each other on a dozen different battlefields. In the bloody chaos, Alexander's entire family was exterminated. His mother Olympias, his wife Roxana, and his young son Alexander IV were all murdered, pawns in the brutal game for his throne. His political dream of a single unified world empire died with him, collapsing into a generation of bloodshed. But from its ashes, a new world was born. By the end of the wars, his empire had been fractured into three major successor kingdoms, ruled by the dynasties of his generals: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedon. These kingdoms would dominate the Mediterranean and the Middle East for the next 3 centuries. And while his political empire failed, his cultural empire succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Alexander's conquests had irrevocably shattered the barriers between the civilizations of the East and West. His armies had been followed by thousands of Greek merchants, artists, engineers, and thinkers, who settled in the new cities he had founded. The result was a new historical epoch, the Hellenistic Age. For the next 300 years, the Greek language became the language of commerce and learning from Italy to India. Greek philosophy, art, architecture, and science spread across the ancient world, mingling with the cultures of Egypt, Persia, and Babylon. In turn, the Greek world was forever changed by the immense wealth and ancient wisdom of the East. The cities he founded, especially Alexandria in Egypt, became the vibrant centers of this new cosmopolitan world. Alexandria, with its great library and museum, replaced Athens as the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, a place where geniuses like Euclid would invent geometry and Eratosthenes would calculate the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. This interconnected, Greek-speaking world that Alexander created is the world that would later be conquered by Rome. The Romans absorbed Hellenistic culture and, in doing so, preserved and transmitted the legacy of Greek thought throughout Western civilization. Alexander's legacy is therefore one of profound contradictions. He was a military genius whose tactical brilliance is still studied today. He was also a ruthless conqueror who was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. He was a visionary who dreamed of a world of cultural fusion and harmony, and a paranoid tyrant who murdered his most loyal friends. He became the ultimate archetype of the great conqueror, the benchmark against which ambitious leaders from Julius Caesar to Napoleon would measure themselves. His political empire was a spectacular failure, a short-lived creation that barely survived its creator. But his cultural legacy was a staggering success. He did not unite the world under a single throne, but he did unite it in a single conversation. He didn't just conquer the world, he remade it, and the world we inhabit today still bears the deep and lasting imprint of his ambition, his violence, and his extraordinary vision.